I am joined by the CEO of Women's Forum Australia, Rachael Wong. Rachael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the 12,000 strong petition in New South Wales, could you tell our viewers a little bit about the Women's Forum Australia?
So Women's Forum Australia is a non-profit think tank that does research, education and policy advocacy around issues affecting women and girls. We have a particular focus on addressing behaviours and practices that are harmful and abusive to them. And we've been around since 2004. It's actually our 20th birthday this year, so yeah.
Well, happy birthday, I guess, is in order. But, I mean, you wouldn't think that the rights of women and girls would have to be defended in the modern age. When I was growing up, this was a debate that was already done and dusted. A bit like the whole free speech and race politics. We thought all of that was settled. It's been a bit of a surprise in the new age that we have to fight these battles. How important is the work that your organisation actually does?
I mean, I obviously think it's incredibly important. And yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, we are still in an age of, women's rights and a focus on sort of improving equality for women. And you hear a lot about it in the mainstream media, but people seem to have forgotten what that really means, or they don't seem to understand what exactly is at stake in some of these sort of more modern developments. So yeah, obviously I'm very, very happy to talk to you more about some of those things.
Yes, well, we've got to go all the way back to basics and define what a woman actually is before we can even defend those rights. But of course, we've seen the rights of women and girls around the world coming under threat from various laws that view self-identification the same as biological gender. One of these laws is making its way through the New South Wales Parliament right now. Now, Rachael, what is this law and what are you concerned about? Like, what is it going to mean for New South Wales girls and women?
So the particular law or reform that you mentioned in relation to sex self-ID is just one aspect of a bill introduced by independent MP Alex Greenwich in August last year, ironically called the Equality Bill. And so that particular aspect of the reforms that he's proposing to introduce in New South Wales will basically allow anyone to change their legal sex on their birth certificate, on other legal documents, and to be treated as that sex for all intents and purposes under law. And so obviously, just in terms of science and logic, that doesn't make any sense. But women's advocates like myself are particularly concerned that it will allow males to self-identify as women and girls with the bare minimum of safeguards, and it will allow them to be able to access female-only spaces like bathrooms, like changing rooms, like refuges, like prisons, with full protection of the law. And, overseas, we've already seen these kinds of self-ID policies and self-ID laws being abused by, for example, in Scotland, male offenders identifying as women to get into women's prisons and then on release actually going back to living their lives as men. We've also seen women being sexually assaulted in what should be female-only spaces by men who are identifying as women, both overseas and in Australia. So obviously we're very, very concerned about that proposal in the bill.
Well, not only overseas, this week we saw swim brand Rip Curl join the ranks of companies who choose transgender women, aka biological men, to represent their brand instead of women. Now, whether it's a brand deal or fairness in sporting competition, women feel that they are either being replaced or destined to give up their podiums to men. Now, I've heard it said by critics that these self-ID laws are all about fairness and equality. Rachael, is it fair to be inclusive of men in women's spaces, or does society need to set some boundaries?
Firstly, that story with Rip Curl was just crazy. It was just, especially given that Rip Curl had just parted ways with female surfer Bethany Hamilton, who had been speaking out against the unfairness of males competing in women's surfing and in women's sport more generally, to then go and replace her with a male who identifies as a woman was just a real slap in the face to women. But in response to your question about whether or not we need to be inclusive of men and women's spaces or whether we need to set boundaries, I think our society has actually already drawn those lines and made those decisions. So if we look at our current society, we already have single-sex spaces and services for males and for females. We have single-sex bathrooms, prisons, we have single-sex sporting teams and events. But what this particular bill or self-ID or gender ideology more broadly is trying to do is it's trying to sell the lie that human beings can change sex, and that therefore if a man says he's a woman, we have to treat him as a woman and allow him to access all those spaces as a woman. So again, I think as a society we've drawn those boundaries, but this particular ideology is coming in and turning it all on its head with its sort of irrational assumptions.
Well, your petition against this bill has amassed 12,000 signatures despite silence from the mainstream press and quite a lot of feminist groups. You've addressed this to Premier Chris Minns, the Attorney General Michael Daly, the Minister for Women Jodie Harrison and Parliament at large. Have you had any response from these ministers or any indication, at all that you are being taken seriously and your concerns for women are being taken seriously?
So I haven't heard, I've actually written to every single politician individually in the New South Wales Parliament, and obviously the petition, as you say, is addressed to those three key government members and the rest of the New South Wales Parliament. I haven't heard specifically from those three members. I have met and spoke to MPs from across the political spectrum, all of whom have concerns about the self-ID aspect of the bill and other aspects as well. But in terms of actual consultation being done by Greenwich or by the government with women's groups sort of face-to-face, there doesn't seem like there's a lot of that being done overall. And the reality is, even if there's sort of, a few people here and there who are willing to directly say to me that they're concerned, if the Labor government supports this, particularly in the Legislative Assembly next week, it will go through because they've got the vast majority in that House. It will be a bit closer in Legislative Council, but unless the Liberals actually vote as a bloc against this bill, like they did in Queensland against the self-ID law in particular, then there's a very, very high chance it'll go through there as well. And my understanding is that Labor is quite supportive of the self-ID aspect anyway, and also the surrogacy aspect of the bill. So people can say all they like that, the Labor government sort of has to do this to appease Greenwich, but I think, unfortunately, a lot of the reforms that he's proposed are actually in line with their values as well.
Well, thank you very much for that. We're just going to take a quick break and we'll be back with Rachael Wong in just a second. Well, we're back with Rachael Wong and we're talking about a new bill that's going through New South Wales Parliament very shortly. Now, Rachael, I haven't heard much said about the commercial surrogacy portion of the bill. Indeed, the topic of surrogacy rarely makes it to the press, if at all, in New South Wales. It is legal in all states as far as I know and seems to cost anywhere from $15,000 to $100,000 per child. But your petition describes a situation where the bans on commercial surrogacy, which is different to private surrogacy, will be lifted, and this will, in your view, encourage the commodification of vulnerable women and the wombs for rent idea and having children as basically products. Can you explain what your fears are in relation to this particular aspect of the bill?
Okay, so myself, other women's rights advocates, children's advocates, human rights defenders have concerns around surrogacy more broadly, but speaking particularly about commercial surrogacy and particularly about overseas commercial surrogacy, which is what this particular bill will legalise, there are several concerns. So firstly, this bill is seeking to circumvent the Federal Parliament's Australia-wide ban on commercial surrogacy, which it implemented for a very good reason, and that was because it couldn't ensure that there wouldn't be exploitation of women and children within surrogacy arrangements. Several states actually allow allow people to go overseas to engage in surrogacy arrangements. New South Wales is not one of those states, and Alex Greenwich is trying to make it so that it is. And so what I'm particularly concerned about with the overseas commercial surrogacy aspect is that it will allow New South Wales residents to go overseas, particularly to poor and disadvantaged countries, and to hire the wombs of women over there and to buy children, basically, from those women. Surrogacy, commercial surrogacy is not something that rich women tend to engage with. It's women who are, struggling to feed their families, come from backgrounds of disadvantage, exploitation, and so on. And so I'm particularly concerned about the exploitation of women in those countries. And I think, there have been so many stories, like even over the past sort of 6 to 12 months, places like Greece, like Ukraine, where it has been shown that exploitation of surrogates is taking place. And there were several stories last year where, Australians had been going to these clinics and it had been shown that actually there was trafficking going on, there was like exploitation of the surrogates who were in the clinics and all of that. So I think to encourage that kind of practice, knowing that these things are happening, I just think is really, really shameful.
Well, it sounds almost as if there is a fear this will open up some kind of child trafficking operation that exploits these poor and vulnerable women, and not to mention questions about what happens if there's something wrong with the child, or if the child is ill and the mother can't the person who organised for the child to be born doesn't want to take the child, or what does that woman then do with that child? Are we going to end up with a whole new class of orphans coming out of this? What happens to the mother of that child if they're injured during childbirth? There's so many things that could go wrong, and I can understand why there would be a problem with this. Is there any sort of perception that you've heard of in the community about how they feel either way? Are people pushing for this to go through, or is this a surprise to you to find it in the bill?
Look, I mean, all of these aspects of the so-called equality bill were not things that were talked about in the election. So they're not things that people knew about or necessarily interested in. Of course, there are always going to be people campaigning for certain elements, but I don't think that there's a majority by any stretch of people campaigning for commercial surrogacy. I think, if any, it's a very small minority.
Yeah, it's not something I've heard people marching on the streets of Sydney about, or even in normal dinner room conversations. You've never really heard it brought up. It's strange that it's now at the forefront of this bill. But the demands contained in the bill, which include the introduction of self-ID, the deregulation of prostitution, removing bans on commercial surrogacy, as we talked about, and changes to the way children can identify their gender. Where is this group of ideas coming from? Because the average woman is they're not standing there screaming to have men allowed into their change rooms. If anything, women are quite put off by the idea that their spaces, which they've enjoyed for so many years, are suddenly being infiltrated by men. Why is this happening now? Why are we seeing bills like this come through? Is there a change in the ideology?
I think there's so much that could be said about this. I think there are a lot of troublesome ideologies floating around the place. I think there is this kind of distorted notion of freedom that, freedom is basically license and we should be able to do whatever it is possible that we can do in terms of what we want. I think that gender ideology is obviously something that's embedded itself within Australian society as well as worldwide, which, as I mentioned earlier, is this notion that gender is more important than biological sex. Anyone can be any gender they choose. I think that there is this kind of Marxist ideology creeping in where the family is considered a source of inequality, and we need to break that down. And I think elements of the bill which allow children to consent to changes to their legal sex or to consent to medical treatment without their parental consent, I think further creates that divide within the family. And I think that there's this sort of, rejection of Judeo-Christian values at large, and I think that obviously covers a lot of things that are just simply part of the foundation of Western civilization. So I think there's a lot of things going on. I don't know that we can necessarily pin it down to one thing. There's also things to do with financial incentives, and we sort of see that especially in the transgender issue as well, with children being signed up as clients for life in relation to things like puberty blockers and hormones and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Well, I guess you can see the logic in it from the point of view of an activist. They can't argue against the protection of women's spaces and the biological need for women's sports. That is pretty much an argument they're never going to win. But they can say, well, a man can now identify as a woman, therefore they're not actually challenging the status of these women's protections, because men are women if they identify as such. So it's like a loophole. They've managed to get around the protections without actually having to debate the protections that are there and their validity. But Rachael, how can people help out on this, particularly if you're in New South Wales? How can they get involved?
If you're in New South Wales, it's critical at the moment that you contact your MP, whether that is by emailing them, calling them, visiting them at their office, and letting them know your views on this, because at the end of the day, MPs, especially in the Legislative Assembly, which is where the debate is being held next week, are steered by the views of their constituents, especially if they hear enough of those constituents making a particular point. So it's really, really important that people reach out to them. You can sign our petition, which is at womensforumaustralia.org/Protect New South Wales. And that also contains a tool which helps you to contact your MPs as well. And then I guess just continuing to have conversations with your friends and family, because unfortunately people are just very ignorant to the fact that this is going on. And that is by design, because there are people that want to rush this legislation through. They know it's controversial. They don't want pushback. And so they're trying to do it as quietly and quickly as possible.
Yes, and if you're watching this online, you can like, share and make sure it goes around your friendship groups so that everyone can see what's going on in New South Wales and to protect women and girls in this state going forward. But thank you, Rachael Wong, for joining us today. It was lovely to have you on, and we wish you all the best in your fight.
Thank you so much, Alexandra.